don't know if you guys can hear it, but all you can hear right now is the hum of bees collecting from this giant goldenrod field. There are a couple more over that direction as well for probably about a mile straight. It is just straight yellow right now. And this yard, as you guys know, has definitely needed it. This is the hunting yard. So a week ago, we went and picked up a tote of syrup from Jim Bearwald. He is the freaking bomb. Well, we are moving on up in the bee world. We've already emptied out some of it, but we got ourselves a tote of syrup that we're gonna be feeding all of the hives with. And one of our landowners, oh my gosh, he is the best. Look at this. This is just like a little elbow you attach on there, and there's a valve right here, and it makes it super easy. You just put a bucket underneath, because that's the way we're doing it. We didn't spend a couple $100s on getting a hose set up yet and a pump, so we're just taking 5-gallon buckets, slide it underneath, and then open up this valve, and it pours right on in and makes it super easy for us. I am so thankful for him. He is a bigger beekeeper. He runs a commercial operation, has been doing it for, I think he said 40 years. So much respect for that man. He has so much knowledge to share. Hopefully we will be able to chat with him on the channel one of these days soon. But anyway, so we picked up a tote of syrup. So I have been putting rounds through these hives that I have behind me since they have been rather light all year. I don't know if it was just this location that didn't really have a whole lot of food in the area. It was also kind of a weird year. It skipped over a lot of our flows that we were supposed to get, like our basswood, black locust, that kind of stuff. So I don't know if it's partially from that, or if maybe this yard is just not the best yard except for goldenrod, because clearly, as we can see, 90% of the plants out here are goldenrod. So no wonder why they didn't get anything all summer long. But anyways, I thought it'd be a perfect day to kind of talk about feeding a little bit, because now is the time that if you want to start feeding your bees, you want to start feeding them now. So let's talk about why and put some feed on these hives. Alright, so before I get into the why, the who, what, when, where, how about feeding your bees, yes, excuse my car, it is dirty. You guys know how it goes with me. I'm a beekeeper and this is a bee car, so that is just what happens. So I have these 5-gallon buckets. We aren't to the level yet where we can just drive the truck around with a trailer on it and a pump and just pump it straight out of the tote. So these buckets actually work just great. And then I have this pump that I've been using that you guys saw last spring. I am still so obsessed with this pump. It was only $10 from Walmart and it is a game changer. I will show you guys as I'm feeding these. But I just wanted to kind of give you guys a peek that you can feed your hives in a way that is economical, and you don't have to spend thousands on just getting a setup in line for your operation. You can do it small scale, you can do it as a sidelander, you can do it as a backyard beekeeper. There's so many different options. You just got to think about it and find the best tools that will fit you the best. Woo. Oh yeah, you can definitely tell goldenrod is here because it has that stinky feet smell. If you smelled it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's like a nasty gym sock, I would say. So it may be a little easier to chat first, because once I start putting this syrup in these hives, it gets so incredibly sticky. My phone has literally been encased in syrup for the last week. No matter how hard I try not to get all syrupy, honestly, I need to just leave it in my car when I start feeding syrup because everything just gets covered. Okay, so what I wanted to help you guys with today, and we'll see how well this goes. If they're getting a little feisty, I might have to put my veil on. It is robbing season technically now that it's almost September 1st. In just a couple days, it will be Labor Day. So yeah, anyway, so what I wanted to help you guys out with today is when to feed, how to feed, all of the details of pretty much fall feeding and preparing your hives for winter when it comes to feeding your hives, because it's something that is so incredibly important for the longevity of your colony throughout the winter time. If they don't have enough stores, of course, they're not going to have enough energy to keep moving on and keep producing brood. So the very first thing that you want to look at when you go up to your hive is you want to assess your hive and see how many stores they actually have. So you generally want to have around if you're doing a double deep, you want to have around 80 pounds of feed. Now I know we're not all going around with our little scale weighing our hive and seeing how much it weighs, but how I usually try to base that is off of when I do lift up my hive from the back. Is it very difficult to lift? This is something that you're going to kind of learn over time as you continue to beekeep, but if it's really hard for you to lift, you have plenty of food. Also, if you're able to look into it, then just seeing that you have the entire top box full of feed, you're going to have plenty of food. There's actually going to be stores left over in the springtime for your bees if we have a generally goodish winter. We want it to be a little bit cold. We don't want it to be mild, because that is what's going to make all of the bees start just blowing through all their foods. So we want a little bit of snow. That actually helps us out a little bit. But if you are in a situation where you don't have those 80 pounds of feed on your colony, 80 pounds of honey, then you are going to want to feed. And if you are overwintering in singles, you're going to want to have around 60 pounds is what I've found to work best for me for overwintering singles. But singles are a little bit tricky because you have to have food that's actually accessible to them, because it's such a small space and they're not able to just move up because the lid's going to be right there. And it's harder for the bees to move across frames that is for them to just go straight up. And that's exactly why Casey and I like the 5/5 setup for a nuke. We overwinter a lot of our colonies in nukes this way. That's actually how we make our spring nukes in the springtime, our overwinter nukes. So if you are doing 5/5, you would generally, just like a double deep, want to have that upper box full of honey as well. So if you are seeing your hives are looking a little bit light, like how these have, if you guys remember when you saw on the tops of the frame that all the corners were empty, they didn't have any honey in it, that is a hive that is definitely starving. This has truly been one of the years. I think the theme of this year is learning how to tell when a colony is starving, because we had a lot of starving colonies this year. This year was so out of the ordinary and so weird. So you learn something new every year. That's what's actually good about beekeeping. So if you go into your colony and you see that they are probably about 80% brood and they don't really have a whole lot of honey stores, you're going to want to feed. And that gets me to my next point, and that is timing when you do feed. So you guys heard me say that I like generally feeding during the goldenrod flow, and there is a reason for this. And as the bees are collecting stores, they are condensing their brood nest so it gets smaller and smaller and encasing their self in honey. They want to do this so that they're able to access that honey in the wintertime, because like I mentioned, it's harder for them to move across frames than it is for them to move up. So they're going to kind of base where they're planning to be overwintering and store that honey in that area. So generally, they encase the whole entire brood nest in honey. And during this time, when the goldenrod starts, this is the very last flow that they're going to be hitting. They're getting stimulated by pollen and they're getting stimulated by a little bit of nectar at the same time. So they have a decent sized brood nest, a decent amount of bees in that colony to get stuff done, because they're preparing for goldenrod. So keeping that in mind, that means that they're going to have more bees in order to be able to store that syrup. That is the biggest challenge of when you start adding in feed late in the year, in say October, is they've already shrank that brood nest down, so they don't have as many worker bees or bees in the hive. I don't know exactly which bees store the syrup that you put in a hive. I wouldn't think it's a worker bee, because, or of course it's a worker bee, but I wouldn't think it would be a foraging bee that would be doing that, because they're going to be out foraging. But anyways, squirrel moment, tangent, back. What was I saying? So there's going to be more bees available during goldenrod that are able to actually start taking down that syrup and storing it as quickly as possible. So I start feeding the moment I start to see goldenrod pop, and you honestly can't really rely on goldenrod most of the time. It is so tempting to kind of hold off and just hope and pray that goldenrod will be enough to get your hives boosted to where they need to be. But I have never seen that in my 5 years of beekeeping. Now, I know 5 years is not very much because every year is different, but I just have learned not to rely on it, so that's usually when I tend to feed. Now, also keeping in mind that they have that pollen coming in. So when you start feeding syrup, you're going to be kind of stimulating a stronger flow for them. That is going to create stronger bees, a bigger brood nest. They're going to be able to, like I said, store all of it. They're not going to have to use as much energy to do everything they need to do. So this is actually the ideal environment that you want your hive to have for your bees going into winter. You don't want to overwork your bees. That is the other reason why I don't generally like to feed super late in the year, because I've learned the hard way. Ask me how I know. You guys remember 2 years ago, I thought it would be a fantastic idea to start 5-frame nukes in August. Yep, don't do it. If you were thinking about doing it, go back through my videos, watch those videos, and you'll see, no, it's not worth it. You'll lose all of them. So from that moment in my life, I learned that feeding bees super late generally just overworks those bees. So by the time winter comes around, they aren't looking the best. Their brood nests start to really shrink, and come springtime, they're so tiny and they're so weak that they just end up collapsing. Not what you generally want to happen. Also, if you live in a northern climate like me, I live in Michigan, and once we start getting to the end of September, we start seeing some... Don't do it. A couple of these are getting feisty, so I'm just going to put my veil on for a second. Once we start getting to the end of September, we start seeing some nights that drop below 50 degrees. Bees cannot take down syrup that is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you have syrup in your colony and they didn't take it all down in that day, say it gets cold, and say that syrup starts to get cold, now the bees have to wait all day for that syrup to warm up, because it takes a little bit for liquids to warm back up. They don't just happen like that. And on top of it, another thing I learned 2 years ago when I was open feeding a lot of my colonies and having them store feed all the way through October and even November, because we were having an Indian summer that year. Then you have all of these open cells with nectar, syrup. I shouldn't say nectar, syrup, but it's not fully honey yet. And the reason I say that is because it's not fully dehydrated. So they have these open cells full of syrup that is emitting all of this moisture into the colony. And when it starts to get cold, well, now it just starts making the hive very moist, and bees, it's cold that they can survive. They can't survive wet cold. That's what really gets them. So to mitigate that, I always try to feed no later than the middle of September. That's when I like to be done. Well, in an ideal world, that's when I like to be done, so they have enough time to dehydrate it and get it ready for winter so that they're ready. And on top of that, like I said, you don't want those bees overworking themselves. If they're having to dehydrate honey or syrup in October, those bees are going to be tired as heck. They've been fanning their wings and vibrating their body all fall long, when they should be saving that for winter time so they can help keep the hive warm, you know? So I'm sure you've probably heard a million times as well that you want to check your mites this time of year. It's getting a little bit late now to be putting mite treatments on your colonies. You wanted to have done that back at the beginning of August, just because they need some time to get those mite levels down before they start making winter bees. And they've already been making winter bees for a month now here. Ooh. I don't like getting stung in the face. Yes, I'm a beekeeper, but getting stung in the face, not my cup of tea. Has happened way too many times. So back to mite treatments. You want to treat before you plan on putting your feed on as well. That is the other reason why I like treating in August, because then September, that's the month of feeding. So they can just start packing on that weight. They don't have to worry about mites anymore. They can just keep on brooding up and using that syrup to make really strong, healthy winter bees, because they're going to be making the last rounds of winter bees in September and October as they slowly shrink their brood nest and encase it in that syrup and that honey. So hopefully that makes sense. I am feeling a little bit foggy headed today. I have not been getting a whole lot of sleep lately. I will tell you guys why soon. There are some new life changes that are coming and I'm in the process of right now. But I don't want to spoil them, so I'll save that for the next video. You guys have to stay tuned for that. But okay, so then the last thing that I did want to talk about is the mixture. So you hear of all the different mixtures of how you should mix your syrup or your sugar water for your hives. And in the fall time, 2-to-1 is the go-to. It's a thicker syrup, so they're able to store it immediately into their comb. And I found that it's easier for them to store it because it has that higher sugar content and you don't have as much water in it, so it doesn't take them as long to also dehydrate it on top of storing it. So you can use syrup or you can use sugar water. And if you don't know what I mean by syrup, we got a tote of 55 corn syrup. So it's 55% fructose and 45% glucose. And so far, I have been absolutely loving it. They've been putting on weight so fast. I've only ran 2 rounds through this yard, and we're gonna be doing the 3rd round today, and they're finally starting to put on weight because gosh, did they seriously need it. But if you are mixing with sugar, then what you want to look for is to mix it 2-to-1 by weight. 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And you don't want to do it by volume. That is the mistake that I made when I first started beekeeping. So you want to find out how much 1 gallon of water weighs. That's usually how I calculate it. I believe it's somewhere around like 8 pounds. And then you do that math with your sugar. So you do 8 pounds of sugar per 1 gallon of water. And I usually mix up these 5-gallon buckets because they're super easy. Just mix it with steaming hot water because we keep our water heater turned all the way up. It doesn't have to be boiled or anything like that. Actually, you don't want to boil it. You do want it to be just below simmering so that it's able to actually integrate. You want the syrup to be see-through by the time you're done. You don't want to see a bunch of granules. You don't want it to be cloudy. That's how you know the sugar has fully mixed into the water and you now have syrup. So there are a couple different ways you can give it to your hives, and this is also the key when it comes to feeding your hives and getting them to actually store it. So we like to use a frame feeder inside. Now I believe there's somewhere between 1.5 gallons to 2 gallons. They might be like 1 3/4 gallon feeder per hive. We generally have one in top and bottom, not in all of these actually this time. So some of these are going to be 8/8 and some of these are going to be like an 8/10, but I will put the frame feeder in the very bottom because that's the closest to the brood nest, so they can just start pulling it out and sticking it wherever they need to in the colony. And honestly, this time of year, they will take that whole entire 2 gallons down, or 1 3/4 gallon down, in 1 day. Now that is the second thing that is key to when you're feeding your bees. You have to feed at a high velocity. And the reason I say that is because when I first started beekeeping, I used quart jars. And I know there are many other beekeepers, new beekeepers out there that use quart jars to feed their bees. And that quart jar is so minuscule in comparison to how many stores, how much it actually takes for them to start storing it and feeding it and storing it into the comb. All of this syrup I've been giving them has been, one, feeding the bees, but also it's allowed them to store it. And I've already done 2 rounds and they still don't have this top box filled. So that just kind of gives you a perspective of how much you actually have to feed. And I say a high velocity because you have to feed them a lot all at once. Otherwise, they start to, at least what I've noticed, is they start to use it as food for themselves if you only feed a little bit at a time. I think it's just because they see, oh my gosh, there's so much of this syrup here, we can't just all eat this, because they look at it as a spill in the colony. So they just are like, okay, let's save it for later, let's just start storing it because this is way too much sugar for us to all just have roaming about in our bellies right this second. Now, if you don't have a frame feeder, another trick you can get is you can get like a 1 gallon bucket, fill that up, poke some holes in it, flip it upside down, and put it on top. Now, I know a lot of backyard beekeepers do not have lids with a hole on top, so I'll tell you guys a little trick. You guys, if you do have a inner cover, then you'll see that that inner cover does have a little opening on top. And what I used to do before we ended up getting these frame feeders and these pallets is I would put a whole box on top of the hive. I would then, or sorry, let me back up. I would put that inner cover on top of the top box. I would then put a box on top of that. And then I'd put that bucket inside that box where that hole is so it's able to drip down. Now, this will also be great because you don't have the sun just beating on it and making it start to ferment. That is something that you want to be aware of, is you don't want a bunch of syrup sitting around for a long amount of time. It will actually ferment and it's not good for the bees. They cannot take it down. And just a little side note, if you want some advice of how to keep your syrup from fermenting, there are a couple different ways, a couple different things you can put in it. My favorite thing is Hive Alive because it's pretty much a superfood for the bees, on top of it keeping the syrup from fermenting. You can also put, a lot of commercial beekeepers will put in a little bit of bleach. It's completely safe to the bees. It's not going to harm them. If you're making a small batch though, you would have to put in a very minuscule amount, maybe like a tablespoon, and that would be enough to keep it from fermenting. You could also do vinegar, and you can also do ascorbic acid, also known as vitamin C. I've used that before too, and that will also help buffer the pH a little bit. I don't know how I feel about, I've read so many studies over the years about the bees needing syrup that's at a certain pH, but then I don't really know how I feel about it because I kind of disagree a little bit when it comes to needing the syrup to be a certain pH, because all the nectars are a different pH. They're not all going to be the same. Now, as long as it's in range, then in general you would think that it's okay. But anyways, side tangent. Okay, so those are the things you can use to keep it from fermenting. Now, you'll also see that there are things like landing board feeders that you can see, or entrance feeders you can see, that will sit right on the front of your hive. I do not like those because this is the time for robbing, so you'll have a lot of bees coming to your hive to try to get that sugar water too because they can smell it, and then they'll be like, hey, well, would you look at that? There's a big old beehive right here that smells nice and sweet with honey, and winter's right around the corner. Why don't I just go get my friends and rob them out? You don't want that to happen. And the same thing with open feeding. That is something that I found. I tried open feeding in my beginning years, and you are just feeding all of the local bees, and the hives you were actually trying to get to take down the syrup to add weight were not gaining weight whatsoever. So I just saw it as a waste of money on the sugar, and it was kind of pointless. So I think in hive feeding or on top of the lid feeding is the absolute best. That way you know for sure that that hive is the hive that's going to be taking down that sugar water. Also, just a side note too, if you do start open feeding, you're going to be feeding all of the yellow jackets. Now, once you start feeding the yellow jackets in your area, you're pretty much encouraging them to stick around and start breeding in that area. And they will find areas, and they will just keep growing in masses and in huge numbers every single year. Say one year you have 20 yellow jackets, next year you'll have 100, next year you'll have 500. Now, it might not be that extreme for how fast they grow, but they do become more and more prevalent in your area if you are keeping them alive by feeding them and whatnot. So we don't want to do that because yellow jackets can actually come in and kill your queen, and they can actually really wreck a hive, especially if you have a weak hive. And since we are on the top of robbing, one last thing I do want to mention is that if you feed one of your hives, feed them all. Because if one hive smells good because of sugar water, because it will give them a smell, a sweeter smell, then all of the hives in that yard are going to start robbing and attacking that hive so that they can get the sugar water that you just put in there. And if it's a weak hive that you're trying to boost, that's not going to end how you were hoping. So even if you have a hive that has quite a bit of honey on it, you can fill a little bit of a bucket or a little bit of a frame feeder, whichever you're using. Say just fill it up a quarter of the way. You don't have to fill it up all the way every single time you feed. And then in your weaker hives, fill those ones up all the way. But that way, every single one does not feel left out, and they're getting a little bit of the cake, I guess you could say. So they don't start being mean to, so they don't start robbing each other and making other hives collapse. You definitely don't want that this time of year. Alright, so I have an idea that these hives are going to be a little feisty, just judging by how some of them are coming to check out my face. Got a little bit of bearding action going on. It's around 91 degrees today. It was starting to get chilly there for a couple weeks, but now we're back into the hot weather. But the goldenrod has seemed to absolutely love it, so I'm not complaining. As long as the goldenrod just keeps carrying on through, we have not had a good goldenrod flow in years, so it'd be awesome if maybe they can actually bring in a little bit of nectar from it. Now, I have heard they don't overwinter the best on goldenrod, but we're also feeding them syrup, so I think the bees know exactly what they need for winter. That's my my thoughts on it. Alright, so as promised, I wanted to show you guys how easy and effective this is. It is freaking phenomenal. So I have this pump like I showed you guys. It is battery powered with just two D batteries. And I've only had to change them out once. I just changed them right before we started fall feeding. So it lasted the whole entire spring through all the spring feedings before I had to put new batteries in it. Now that is awesome. Okay, so this one I do not have in the bottom box. I generally like to have it down there just because, like I said, it's right next to the brood nest. But some of them do have it in the upper box, and that's okay. So all I do is stick it in the bucket, stick this little hose right here, turn it on, and just wait for it to be filled up. See how easy that is? Anybody can do this. A backyard beekeeper can do this. You don't have to have a ginormous setup. So it just makes having healthy bees a little bit easier for you. And each one of these takes about, I would say 45 seconds, maybe 30 seconds to fill up all the way. It doesn't take very long at all, so I'm able to do all of these hives in under 20 minutes when I do come out here. Well, that is when I'm not just chatting away, you know, when I'm just coming out here to get some work done, but that is okay. I have noticed these hives have been a little bit nicer to me since I have fed them. I don't blame them, because now they see me as, like, the beekeeper, the mama that comes and brings them food so they don't collapse, which is good. And then I just turn it off, and there you go. Move on to the next one. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, you know? Just another random kind of side tangent from this year is in the learning what it looks like to have a starving colony, I realize a lot of the brood diseases that we see is generally caused by lack of food in your hive. So if you're starting to see sick brood in your colony, look at how much honey resources you have in your hive. Also check your mite load too, that is also very important. But if you don't have a whole lot of honey in your hive, the nutrition is going to go down, and that's what makes strong bees. Good nutrition, low mites, great queen. Isn't that what Ken Reynolds says? Something like that. But alright, I am going to get to feeding these hives and go home and take a nap because your girl really needs some. I'm a little bit delusional. So I hope this video was a little bit helpful and that I wasn't just kind of like rambling on and things gonna get jumbled up. I just hope it all made sense. If it made sense, let me know in the comments. I always love reading them. But alright, enjoy your guys' day, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Don't quit and be fit. Woo, look at that. Definitely say they're making use of all this syrup I'm giving them. They are storing it right away. They're going to be looking nice and fine for winter time. Even drawing some comb. Would you look at that?